I think titles are also important. And so this was sort of more our title, but we got it in a little bit too late. So decision support in the absence of predictability as we know it. And the idea is to try and escape from model land, right? We have a tendency to build models and then live there and come back to reality. And there are a number of people who supported this over a very long time. And I think one of the places that, well, I might begin to wonder if I'm human, or if Eric is human, because people like David, right, for a long time have said, humans have to come to a certain degree of conviction that they actually believe something, right? Certainty, not conviction. And I don't think Erica does that. And I try not to do it myself. And in fact, none of these guys, this is Kevin Judd and Hailey Du, Jim Berger, my favorite living Bayesian, Brian Hoskins, Erica's thesis advisor, and a really good meteorologist, David himself, and John Wheeler. I don't know about all of them, but I think many of them do. What we try to do, instead of coming to this predict and act and be certain, we still make the decisions, some of them not revocable, but we still monitor the situation. And we try to do it probabilistically, right? We don't have to have 100% certainty before we actually act. And I'm going to suggest that this is that this is an interesting alternative.
So the place where we can predict and act and be confident is obviously model land. So we, I guess in CATS, the Centre for the Analysis of Time series, where Lenny and I work, we are particularly interested in finding examples where we're trying to use these models, but where we want to use them in the real world. So we want to get out of model land, escape from model land, back into the real world, and use the information that we've gained from that modelling to support a real life decision. So to start, as Edmund did, with a few take-home messages, when you're in model land, that's a really comfortable place to be. It's somewhere that you can feel confident that you've defined everything, somewhere that you can make sure you've listed all your parameters, you can select your parameters, you can do everything. You can feel very happy there, very confident that you've done what you need to do. Until you try to apply that to the real world. And, maybe for a while it works, and then suddenly it fails, and it fails horrifically. Now what are we going to do? And that's the premise of this conference, right? So can we anticipate that? Can we move out of model land into a less comfortable but better informed real world more quickly? Can we get there? Letting go of these fantastic mathematical objects, and as we'll see, looking for some alternatives.
So it's those tools, those mathematical tools, which allow us to do things which actually don't make any sense at all, mathematically. We end up finding ways of analyzing a model that are that don't actually match the mathematical properties of the model itself. So nonlinearity, just the acceptance of nonlinearity, just has game-changing impacts. So we're not going to talk so much about weather and climate forecasting per se, right? But weather-like forecasting. In a weather-like forecast, your model lasts a long time compared to the decision you're making, right? We've launched weather forecasts every 6 hours. We make the same sort of decisions a long time. We have a long library of forecast outcome archive. In climate-like decisions, we tend to only make the decision once, and the system sort of changes a lot. But what's really different is the model has a lifetime often much shorter than the decisions that we're trying to make. So we change climate models every 4 or 5 years, pretty much. We're making 100-year, and yet it's very hard to get someone to defend a model that isn't state-of-the-art, right? Meaning very, very young, even though we're making these huge, long forecasts. So our aim, really, in terms of decision support, is to be sufficiently confident in the process that even if it goes wrong, right, if the outcome is not what you want, it's a probabilistic outcome, and you actually use the same process again, as opposed to going off and building a bigger model or a smaller model. That's the sort of goal we would actually like to reach. Oh, and the last thing that I didn't want to miss, we're Bayesians when we're in model land, but when we come out of model land, we have to realize that the model's just wrong, right? So we always supply and request the probability of a big surprise. We'll come back and talk about that a little more later. So we're both going to talk to this slide. So we're both physicists, but I'm an American physicist and she's a British physicist. We come into model land.
Very different.
Up here. And I tend to sort of immediately head down, my thinking tends to come down this way towards physical science and trying to actually build models that really do represent, right? Physical laws for me don't govern the world, but they reflect the world, they describe the world. But if we aren't careful, we end up getting down here to the desert of precise physical laws, and I'm not going to make it, we're not going to have those laws in my lifetime, but with bigger computers and more understanding, we head straight for this cliff of false faith and convergence. On the other hand, we can move over here to the Bayesian quarter, which is excellent. I have really good friends in this quarter, but we don't want to keep the word probability by falling off the subjective probability, because who cares? Right? That's an I.J. Good quote. And yet we want the insights of a very clear formulation of the problem in probabilistic terms. So the Bayesian way is extremely popular here, but we can't always solve that problem once we set it up.
So the black hole in the middle is the wormhole back from model land into reality. This is our sketch of model land. And there are many ways out of model land. There are, accepting that we may make qualitative insights while we, there's a Freudian slip, qualitative insights while we are developing these models, that we could use the model building process not just as a way of arriving at a finished model with its numerical outputs, but also as a way of developing and guiding and gaining confidence in our understanding of the system itself. The simplification, the idea that not by continuing to add complexity, as other speakers have said over the last couple of days, that increasing complexity may not actually bring us more detailed representation. It may not bring us the right answer. It may not bring us effective decision support. So we can kind of spiral around that exit, that black hole back to reality. Something else to look out for is the amusement park of optimal solutions, which, again, if we can optimize, maximize, we can again feel very happy about what we've done in model land. Is it bringing us closer to the exit towards reality or not? I mean, that's something I think to reflect on in the context of an individual model, not necessarily to say that we can never get from the amusement park to the exit.
So, and of course, this is only a model. So again, what we're saying really isn't that new. I've cut most of the historical slides because we had so many interesting things to pick up on yesterday's talks. But Alfred North Whitehead, criticizing Newtonian mechanics for crippling physics for 100 years after general relativity came out, more or less says, there's this problem that it's great to make models, what he called modes of thought, but you have to remember that you've abstracted from things. There are things that aren't there. And one of those things, you can try to figure out which of those things is actually the dominant relevant uncertainty. Which of those things is most likely to bite you, and try to actually talk about that. His point was that his point here is that nobody listens. Right? Very, very often nobody listens. You couldn't, it was very. There are whole fields that are now dominant where you couldn't publish because you didn't meet the sort of standards of the day. So, what about chaos?
So, I'm aware that we've got a very mixed audience. Perhaps we could have a show of hands of who's heard of the butterfly effect. Practically everybody, fantastic. So then you're familiar with this idea that if we don't know precisely the initial conditions of our system, our model, our dynamical simulation perhaps, and we try to make a prediction about it, then we will be in error in some way. But this is actually quite a good situation, because we know what to do about it. We can make what we call, in physics land, an ensemble of models, of initial conditions, and we can project all of those forward in time and make our prediction, which will end up being a probabilistic prediction. We can say, all right, we have a PDF of the initial condition, we can have a PDF of the prediction, and that will work on some time scale, and on some longer time scale it'll just all disappear off to infinity and it'll be completely useless. But it will still be correct. We will know that we have a completely useless prediction.
And the idea of moving to high-dimensional thinking was discussed, it's mentioned yesterday several times. In operational weather forecasting, where this is done 4 times a day, they're using ensembles with 51 ensemble members, and they're in a 10⁷ dimensional space. So I think they probably win in terms of operational high dimensions.
Here we have a three-dimensional version projected onto a two-dimensional screen for ease of viewing. So you've all heard of the butterfly effect then. How many people have heard of the hawk moth effect? 2, 3, 4. Great. So this is the ugly sister, or the black sheep of the family. The hawk moth effect is a statement not of dynamical instability, but of structural instability. So instead of having an imperfectly specified initial condition, we have an imperfectly specified model. Now that should ring a few bells. If we have an imperfectly specified model, then what's going to go wrong? So this is the same picture again. Instead of having error in the initial condition, we now have a perfectly specified initial condition, but we have a imperfectly specified model. And it's only slightly wrong. It's out by, epsilon x. And again, what we see is that you start being correct, and over some time scale, your projections diverge arbitrarily far from the one that you would hope you were making the correct prediction. Now, what are the consequences then of this hawk moth effect? The difficulty is that you might think we could do exactly what we did for the butterfly effect. We could take, rather than an ensemble of initial conditions, we could take an ensemble of models and project those forward. But unlike in the first case, where our state space is well defined and we know exactly what are the parameters which we can vary in order to create that ensemble, now in model space we effectively have an infinite set of possible structural formulations for a model, and we can't adequately sample that with any finite set of models. So any ensemble will always be an ensemble of opportunity, it will always be imperfect, and it can never adequately capture the true uncertainty. So we will always end up with a situation where an arbitrarily small error in the structural specification of the model could lead to an arbitrarily large error on an unknown timescale of the output prediction.
So again, Poincaré talked about this on the issues of one of the real values of doing mathematics and modeling is that the mathematics can show you things you don't believe or hadn't thought of. And that's exactly what happened to him when he found out that his prize-winning essay for solving the three-body problem was wrong. And he ended up proving that you can't solve the three-body problem. I'd just like to say, so the hawk moth effect actually comes from Erica's thesis. And this is just much, much, much harder than chaos. With chaos, we have a chance of pulling out probabilities. But here, these distributions are just different. We can get information from them, but depending on the level of the model error, they're just different. So that introduces the possibility of a big surprise, right? So what's a big surprise? A big surprise is when something happens that our models just can't mimic. And after the fact, we can go back. It's not that we didn't have a big enough ensemble, they just can't do it. Right? So whenever we try to talk about real-world problems that are being worked at, we put a purple light in our little display. So purple light means the model says this can't happen. The model says we can't be here. Look away now. And we try to extract a probability of a big surprise or make one up ourselves, right? And then that goes along with any probabilities that are conditioned on the model. And if the probability of a big surprise is a half or 90%, then how you use the probability of the model's telling you doesn't. It's very hard to do anything. Big surprises invalidate model-based probability distributions. It's not probability theory. This is not an issue of Bayesianism. It's not that Bayesianism is wrong. It just doesn't apply. They change the thing we're conditioning on. We have P of X conditioned on I. They change the I, right? We change our models. We include liquidity. We do something different, right? We've learned something. And so, of course, in weather-like tasks, we can see this happening. In climate-like tasks, we really can't. Do you want to add something here, or shall we? Okay. So, model-based probability statements are incomplete unless we actually provide some kind of quantitative expression. And I give an example here from climate change. This is the model version of South America minus reality. So this is the Andes, which are 2 kilometers too short. This is the Okefenokee, my favorite swamp. The Florida-Georgia border. The thing here is we know these are not in our models. And so as we think about time scales and time into the future, right, we can actually get an idea of whether or not this is going to cause us a problem. We can't do that in the model, right? The model cannot see it because it isn't there, but we can do it. right? And then we get an idea of what the sunset time is for our model. We don't really want to go further than that. Oh, the last one is we do that by thinking not of these known unknowns and unknown unknowns, but by known neglecteds. It's not like we can't model rock, right? We know how to model rock, but if we model rock well, this model will run slower than real time.
So how do we get out of model land then? What does it mean? It doesn't mean throwing away the model. It certainly doesn't mean stopping development of the model. It doesn't even mean interpretation of those model results. It means translation. You know, your Brexit white paper translated into German using Google Translate is not a translation. And similarly, a model output that has been simply, taken as if it were to apply to the real world is not an effective translation of that model for use in that real world. How do we then apply the testing in order to understand what is the relationship between those model outputs and the variables that we're actually able to define and measure in the real world? How are we adding information by the use of this model to our background knowledge?
So there are lots of reasons for staying in model land. I mean, I really like well-posed problems that have exact solutions.
But if you try to use these in the real world, they may simply not apply.
And the word optimal has not appeared in a thesis of a student of mine for about 10 years, but optimal solutions are there in model land, and I can actually find some of them, and you do nice mathematics.
But again, having found those optimums, they may not perform as you expect in the real world.
But I can be a Bayesian, right? I can define everything and solve everything. I can just do what I want to do.
So you can describe the challenge, and that's great, and that's really useful, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to a complete solution within the confines of the real world.
So the same way, like in that first butterfly effect, it can be really expensive to get actionable probabilities, but I can actually get them and I can use them optimally.
Now that if we're creating probabilities that are conditioned on something that we know to be untrue, if we have a probability that says the probability is 50%, given that my model is perfect, and we know that the model is not perfect, what does that even mean? The probability of a big surprise must be greater than 0, probably significantly larger.
Okay, so then falling back to the nonlinear systems and chaos are really cool, right? I did it in my thesis. I like these things. And there's a host of interesting mathematical problems that I can solve in model land.
Which is absolutely true. But what does that mean for the real world? So, I mean, everybody here hopefully has an interest in how the results of what we're doing actually apply to the real world. That's what we're trying to find out. So the mathematician's playground absolutely is useful, is interesting, is really helpful for developing insight, but how are we going to get back to the real world?
Okay, so one of the ways of doing that is to practice, right? I find practicing with using real-world probabilities extraordinarily informative, and people fall into two camps. One of my students has an algorithm for this game. 538 hosts beat the team. He's Chinese. I don't think he's ever seen a football game. And he doesn't need to. He just runs his algorithm and puts it up. I sit there with this thing, do I want 77 or 75? It's really hard. There's no money here. This is not even bragging rights. I'm not on the leaderboard. But all three of us are above the 95th percentile. Well, we were before last night's game. So we can remove incentives to provide a precise answer to a slightly different question. You can test the robustness under artificial structural model error. That's what we did. You take your model, you change something a little bit, does it fall apart? Right? There are ways of actually telling where you are, but the main thing is to reward insight, not pretty pictures and graphics.
So here's an example. We've worked with the START network, which is a group of humanitarian NGOs who work around the world to anticipate disasters and to release financing to provide humanitarian aid before the disaster strikes, hopefully, with the aim that this will reduce the damage caused. So we've worked on heatwave in Pakistan, and the decision makers there are confronted with a very wide variety of forecasts that are available. So their question was, well, where do we go? We have AccuWeather on the one hand, which will give you forecasts several months in advance with a detail of one day. Should we use those? That's the best available information. Is that what we should go for? On the other hand, the Pakistan Meteorological Department was only providing forecasts for 3 days. And they said, well, we really need a bit more lead time than that in order to be able to make an effective decision and take action based on that decision. So they came to us and they said, well, again, as Lenny was saying, what is the lead time over which these weather forecasting models can give us useful information? So we were able to look at past performance and demonstrate that a sensible time scale for heatwave forecasting in this region of the world, and of course it's different depending on where you are, would be around 7, 8, maybe 10 days. And that actually is super useful for them because that's a time scale on which they can identify in the forecast that there's something about to happen. They can go through their very stringent decision-making processes in order to release this funding. And obviously this has to be extremely well documented because they're using donated money. And then they can activate the release of financing and they can actually start to do something on the ground. So these are the sorts of questions that we can start to answer, is looking at what are these timescales for different models? Where is it useful? Where is it not useful? Are there purveyors of complete misinformation out there that should just be ignored? Or is there actually more information than you could get from the standard sources? Lenny's got a few other examples here.
Yeah, so these examples are, we're not really aiming at just weather. In fact, we're moving further and further from our expertise and becoming, how do you find that exit? How do you find useful information in models that are fundamentally flawed? How do you avoid taking too much out, even if you give a probability of a big surprise? And this is last week's hurricane graphic for probabilities. The problem is that these storms, 70% storms don't form 70% of the time, right? So how do you use that? This is a method of trying to get information into a weather model. This is actually a 15-day forecast for the St. Jude storm. It actually shows up fairly well, in these two ensemble members. How do we not lose that information? The IPCC sort of acknowledges that the distribution the distributions here would be wider if we actually included structural and model uncertainty. So it's not like this is rejected. The question is we don't really know how to do it. Nuclear stewardship is extremely interested in this since they're unable to test for 20, 30 years. The Norroyal lifeboats, how many hunting licenses for Norwegian reindeer should you offer in a changing climate if you want to maintain the population? And how can you predict that jellyfish are going to shut down your nuclear power plants on the coast because they clog up the things? Seeing these things coming with just a day or two advance warning can make a huge difference. And we think, I think even more strongly after yesterday, that many of the lessons learned in these applications of escaping from model land actually apply to could be applied to macroeconomics.
So there's a series of critical distinctions that we won't go through in detail, but is your best available model adequate for your purpose? So don't just look for the thing that appears to be providing the most information. Is it actually right or not? Should we, is the model helping us to understand, or is it just generating another system which is just as complex as the system that you didn't understand in the first place?
And you might, this is yours too. Okay, you might be living in model land if you're trying to optimize everything and represent the future well. If you set the probability of a big surprise because there's nothing your model can't do. If you desire one model to rule them all, instead of a bunch of different models with different structures which tell you different things sometimes. How do you decide? Okay, these are words we deprecate. But you might be near the exit, right? If you're concerned that your forecast system's probability of a big surprise may be a bit too high, or you realize that your team would actually just build a much bigger model, they wouldn't get probabilities out of the model if they had a lot more resources. We really want to distinguish X from model land namesakes, X model. These are just different things. In physics, these are different things, right? Temperature and model temperature are just different things. And we'd really like to have more of these, right? We'd really like to get a better idea of what are the sorts of things that cause you conflict and worry about moving from model land back to the real world.
So we're not aiming to throw away models completely. We don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, but we want to find a way of bridging that gap, which is a large gap between the model as it is in your computer or on your piece of paper and reality as it is out there in the messy, complicated real world.
And that's exactly what I want to conclude on, right? I think the point is we're not suggesting that you don't use models. We just suggest you treat them as models. And there are ways to interpret models without actually thinking interpreting them as if they were perfect. And we'd love to find more examples and opportunities to trace those connections, because one of the things that does generalize between many of these things is the details are completely different. Right? But the connection or the pathway or the weakness between that model and reality is often reproduces itself in many, many other places. So thank you very much.